Flash carts are designed to let you play ROMs on original hardware rather than through emulation, made for those that feel that the real consoles are an important part of the gaming experience. In a previous episode, I covered the EverDrive line of flash carts and highlighted how there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with this technology beyond simply playing games that, well, you may or may not own. Stuff like fan translations, fan games, and other feats that can push the hardware beyond what you might have thought was possible. We originally intended for the EverDrive's episode to be about flash carts in general, but ultimately decided that it was just too much and that some of these alternatives needed their own episode. This time, Try is going to take a look at the Super UFO Pro 8, an extremely affordable flash cart for the Super Nintendo that gets a lot of hate around the internet. But once you know how to use it right, it may just offer you more than you might expect.
A more recent evolution of an older and much larger device that dumped Super Nintendo ROMs to floppy disks, the SD card-capable Super UFO Pro 8 is readily available from places like Amazon for around $60, making it even more affordable than the Super EverDrive and vastly below the premium SD2 SNES. Unfortunately, the Super UFO is very poorly documented, and forum threads have conflicting claims about what it can even do, and overall assessments tend to range from "it's pretty good" to "it's totally worthless trash." It's a device with plenty of quirks and shortcomings, but to the right person, this could be the perfect SNES flash card. Like me, for example. Or maybe I shouldn't say it's the perfect SNES flash cart for me, but it's as good a one as currently exists for how I'm interested in using flash carts. Because for me, owning and using my real game cartridges is really important, but I can't easily play a lot of my Japanese imports without fan-made translation patches, so I have to use a device that gives me access to the ROM data in such a way that I can patch it, and I'm no programmer, so the process needs to be pretty easy. In the past, I've dabbled in patches with the Retron 5, but I'd so much prefer to do it on real SNES hardware if I could. So dumping your own ROMs, patching your own ROM dumps, transferring saves from and back to real cartridges? Does that sound cool to you? Because that sounds pretty cool to me. If that doesn't sound cool to you, then there's not much reason to get a Super UFO over a Super EverDrive or SD2 SNES other than cost. You'll be perfectly happy as long as you understand the limitations of each. And hey, I get it, the ROM on my cart is just the same as most of the dumps that are already flowing around the internet, though there are bad dumps out there. So the act of dumping the ROM inside my own cartridge for my own use may seem needless to a lot of people, but I just think it's cool. The process can be a little fiddly, but once you understand what's going on, it's easy. But before we get too deep into that, the Super UFO can of course still be used like a standard flash card. Download ROMs, put them on the SD card, and go for it. While loading ROMs may not be as speedy as other flash cards, it plays most games just as well. The Super UFO even works with PAL consoles, though it won't boot up with an NTSC cartridge on top. You can run NTSC ROMs however, at least the ones I tested. When playing on a PAL console, music and sound effects seem to play at the correct speed, but the game is otherwise slowed down. But as you might guess if you're familiar with the Super EverDrive situation, some of the SNES's best games include additional processing power inside the cartridges themselves, and those just aren't going to work without a more extravagant device like the SD2 SNES, and even that can't yet simulate Super FX games like Star Fox or Yoshi's Island, or SA1 chip games like Super Mario RPG and Kirby Superstar. One of the most compelling things about the Super UFO then is that it can actually interface with hardware contained within the locked-on cartridge on top to play these games. Well, some of them anyway. There's a lot of conflicting information out there as to whether the UFO can actually do this, but it can. Expect limited results, but here are a few examples of what you can do with this feature. For one, you could play the Japanese ROM of Super Mario Kart while utilizing the DSP-1 chip inside your North American copy, and enjoy the original Japanese victory animations. I even had success in playing fan-made Mario Kart track hacks. Pilot Wings is also DSP-1, and the same region switcheroo works here too. But could you use the DSP-1 chip in Mario Kart to play Pilot Wings? Sadly, not really. As much as I wanted to find some cool example of a game that would work with another cartridge's hardware from the same special chip family, it just doesn't seem to work out. Games designed for Capcom's Cx4 chip, utilized by both Mega Man X2 and X3, cannot run on the Super EverDrive, but the Cx4 hardware in these cartridges do work through the Super UFO. If you have no cartridge on top, then character sprites won't even appear in the game. Kinda interesting to see how it works, right? Similar to Pilot Wings and Mario Kart though, anticipate glitchy results if you only own one of the cartridges and hope to play X3 with X2's cartridge hardware or vice versa. But the region swap does work. If you were so inclined, you could use the much less expensive Japanese cartridges to play the North American ROMs in English. The fact that it works is just fascinating to me. Here's an even wilder one. If you run a Super Game Boy ROM, meaning a dump of the software that runs the Super Game Boy, while using a Super Game Boy 2 on top of the UFO, then you get access to the original Super Game Boy borders on the Super Game Boy 2 hardware. And it works the other way around too. I mean, there's really no point to this, but I think it's a super fascinating demonstration of how the special hardware is being utilized. Unfortunately, I did not have the same success with different releases of Super FX games. I could not play the Japanese version of Star Fox or Stunt Race FX with my North American carts. But the Super FX chip inside both games does correctly pass its processing functions through the UFO if you're playing the ROM of that game. Although there's not much reason to do that aside from the novelty of proving it works when you could just play the same cartridge without the UFO. You're sadly unlikely to get Yoshi's Island working properly, which uses the second revision of Super FX. And I could not find a way to run a ROM of the infamously unreleased Star Fox 2. Whether it might be possible to get these to run properly with more intensive ROM editing, I couldn't say. SA1 chip games, which include a few of the best late SNES titles, are thus far a no-go on all SNES flash carts, as far as we know, including the UFO. Despite this incompatibility with a handful of heavy hitters, you're likely to find that the UFO will play most games without issue. Everything from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, to the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, and almost all of the popular RPGs, none of these games use special hardware. Check Wikipedia for a list of Super Nintendo and Super Famicom cartridges that contain enhancement chips. For my purposes, this has caused very few issues in how I want to use the Super UFO, because it's mainly for dumping ROMs of my Super Famicom games and playing them with the translation patches. Once I understood what I was doing, it was easy to dump and patch my own copies of Dragon Quest V, Final Fantasy V, and even much larger 32 megabit ROMs like Seiken Densetsu 3, Treasure Hunter G, Wonder Project J, and a bunch of others. One game that I'd like to play the patch for, Marvelous, uses the SA1 chip, so unfortunately that ain't happening without an emulator. Fans of Star Ocean and Tales of Phantasia are also out of luck. Those are the biggest Super Famicom ROMs, bigger than the UFO's 32 megabit DRAM size. That's basically the size of game that can be loaded into it to actually play. And some patches can unfortunately pad out a game's ROM size, which is causing me problems with the Dragon Quest III remake. The patch bumps the ROM up from 32 megabits to 48 megabits, making the translation unplayable on the Super UFO. So anyway, dumps and patches. As I said before, the UFO is kinda quirky and poorly documented. None of its functions are as straightforward as I wish they could be, but I have to give big thanks to Steve Kulov of HD Retrovision, Artemio Urbina, the creator of the 240p test suite, and our go-to mod guy Voltar, because without their expertise in how ROMs and game hardware actually work, this episode would not be possible. And the same goes for everyone who has helped us understand so much for all of our hardware-focused episodes. These guys are the true experts, and they gave a lot of their time to help me crack what makes the Super UFO tick. First, be sure your SD card is formatted in FAT32 and inserted into the Super UFO. Always be sure the console is off when you lock on or remove a game cartridge from the Super UFO. From the main menu, the first thing you'll want to do when dumping your own ROM is to go to the lower middle icon to bring up the check menu and choose Cart Check. Here you'll see some information on the game cartridge, but there are really only two things you need to look at. First, next to PROM size, ensure that the left number matches the number in brackets. Hit the B button to cycle through the sizes. The brackets number should be the actual ROM size, while the number on the left is the size that the ROM will dump to. I can't explain why they aren't automatically equal, but whatever, you just gotta do it. Then run a checksum. Each ROM has a small line of code that is generated by the sum of its code, which is checked against what the UFO reads from the cart, thus confirming if they match for a good dump. This will not check out if the dump size is incorrect or any pins are too dirty to make a strong connection. This will take several seconds depending on the ROM size, but it's really important to verify before dumping the ROM. Once you confirm a good checksum, return to the main menu and go to the upper right icon, the backup menu. From here you can move game ROMs and saves to a variety of locations, but for now let's just back up the game cart to the SD card. When you're in the directory you want to dump to, hit the start button to name your file. X deletes, B confirms, and Y cancels out. The UFO can only display up to 8 characters for a file name, so make sure the truncations are something you can recognize. Now this is important. Never use lowercase letters. For some reason, Windows refuses to copy UFO dumps if they contain any lowercase letters. You can edit the file extension, but for now, I recommend sticking with the default .ufo. Hit start to begin the dumping process, which takes about 10 seconds for a 4 megabit game and about 70 seconds for a 32 megabit game. Oh, and if you're having fantasies about dumping Game Boy ROMs and saves through the Super Game Boy, forget about it. The UFO software can dump the Super Game Boy software ROM, but it has no access to the Game Boy cartridge slot. While I have no experience with other ROM dumpers, you might want to look into devices like the Retrode if you're interested in creating dumps for other systems. But here's a funny story. While I was editing this episode, Artemio Urbina was helping dump some very rare SNES prototype ROMs, some of which were undumped, and he was easily able to dump them with the Super UFO, while the Retrode required configuration before he could achieve the same results. Anyway, back at the main menu, you can go to the upper left icon to play any game on your SD card. 32 megabit games take about 30 seconds to load into the DRAM. But since a lot of these are in Japanese, let's take the ROMs back to the computer for patching. First of all, the UFO dumps have an added 512 byte header to the beginning of the ROM dump, which you can see in a hex editor. This is a harmless and mostly irrelevant string of code that should have no impact on how the game plays, and in the early emulation days, it was pretty standard for a ROM to have an added header. However, there's really no reason for them nowadays, and getting rid of it first makes it a lot easier to apply patches. Artemio Urbina whipped up a simple little program just for UFO files that lets you remove the header and resave the file with the more standard .sfc extension. If you were to compare this scrubbed file to a verified unmodified headerless ROM from the internet, and you gotta be careful because not all of them are perfect, but in theory they should check out as completely identical. I mean, that's kinda neat, right? That's your very own ROM dump, you made that! Instead of Lunar IPS, which I'd used for patching before, Voltar recommended to me a nifty little program called SFC SNES ROM Utility by Wasabi. You can download this and other utilities as well as patches for a ton of different games from romhacking.net. That's the only in-depth repository for fan patches that we're aware of, though you might find others not on this site if you search around. A lot of these patches are very old and unmaintained, and the rules for applying them in a way that works can vary a bit, especially when it comes to using them on original hardware as opposed to an emulator environment. The Wasabi tool made it much easier for me to apply patches in a way that successfully ran on the Super UFO. Simply load your ROM with the header already removed, click IPS patch, and then OK. Choose your patch file, and then it will ask whether it requires a headered ROM. The reason it has to know is because where the patch is applied in the code would be incorrectly offset if, for example, the ROM has no header, but the patch was designed for a ROM with a header. Most patches include a README file that specifies whether the patch should be applied to a headered or unheadered ROM. For my games, when I didn't know what the patch required, I found more success when saying yes, header required. This makes it so that the Wasabi program applies a header required patch correctly, even to an unheadered ROM. You still need to use Artemio's tool to remove the header and change the extension before the Wasabi utility will even open a UFO ROM dump. After the new file is created, simply rename it something that's 8 characters or less for easy use in the UFO. It might sound like a lot of steps, but it actually goes quite quickly. With this method, I got every single one of my Super Famicom carts with available translation patches working on the Super UFO, with the exception of the aforementioned Dragon Quest III Remake patch due to its file size bloat. I used a more recent Rockman 7 patch which translates some dialogue not in the American version by using a program by BU called Beat. This is for a newer patch format called BPS. And some problematic patches might also work with some careful manual tweaking if you're a programming sort. You can of course also load up pre-patched ROMs that you've downloaded. Most should already follow the UFO's rules. But patching your own ROM dump is all part of the fun and satisfaction, right? Right? I mean, I think so. And it's cool that it gives you the chance to confirm which cartridge revision you might own. Well, even if you think I'm crazy for doing all this extra work just to use my own ROM dumps, the UFO's ability to back up saves from real cartridges and restore those saves back to the cartridges is likely the more standout feature for a lot of people. In addition to the DRAM, the UFO also has its own SRAM, static RAM. That's what's used for saves, complete with the standard CR2032 battery that SNES games use for keeping the save memory active. So yeah, nothing fancy going on here. If you ever need to replace the battery, this is simple to do, and unlike game cartridge batteries, requires no soldering. The built-in SRAM is how saves are actively stored on the unit while you're playing a ROM loaded into the UFO, but it's only good for one game at a time, so be careful to back it up before loading up another game. Save backup to the SD card is not an automatic process like it is with the latest EverDrives. While I was playing through Seiken Densetsu 3, I made SD card backups and copied it back to my real cartridge as well, just to be extra safe. What was kind of neat was that despite my playthrough being of the patched version of the game, the saves worked just fine on the original Japanese cart, at least in this case. I think it'll be fun to continue doing that as a habit, if nothing else just to make the real cartridges an ongoing part of my experience playing through the translated games. At any rate, the best use of the SRAM is as an intermediary for shuffling saves around. In the backup menu, the bottom 4 choices are for SRAM. There is no option for moving cartridge SRAM directly to the SD card, so you must first move the SRAM from the cart to the UFO, which just takes a second. You can then send the UFO SRAM to the SD card for safekeeping, and of course you can also put it on your computer, store it in the cloud, and even load it up in an emulator. If you want to restore the save after replacing your cartridge battery at some point, or you just want to load another set of saves into it, simply send the SRAM from the SD card to the UFO, and then from the UFO to the cartridge. This is of course a lot more complicated than managing saves on EverDrive, which you usually don't have to really think about that much, but I think for a lot of people the ability to interact with the SRAM on the original cartridges makes it worth the hassle. You can also use emulator saves if they're saved as proper uncompressed raw SRAM files, with a little bit of fiddling. For the UFO to accept it as SRAM, the file must be padded out with null data to 512 kilobytes, up to address 1FFFF. Our friend Artemio has added this as an automated function in the previously mentioned UFO Manager tool. And you know, I've been wondering, it might even be possible to ferry saves to and from the Wii Virtual Console with the Homebrew channel, but that's a whole other matter and set of potential tools that I'm just not informed enough about yet to be sure it'd work out. Be warned that it might be risky trying to back up saves from games that the Super UFO won't run, like SA1 chip games. The UFO just doesn't know how to properly access these games, and it's possible that messing with them could ruin your saves. The UFO also offers some token cheat functionality, which it calls Hyper Mode. For one, this lets you use a save state while playing, which you can continue to update and load, and can even be retained after turning the system off and backed up to the SD card via the power-up menu. But it's rather fiddly and doesn't work well with every game, so don't necessarily count on it. 2 slow-mo speeds can be activated as well. Hyper Mode offers a Game Genie type function too. X-Terminator for codes manually activated by holding R and L plus start, and Goldfinger for codes that are just always on in Hyper Mode. I don't want to spend too much time on this feature because, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really interest me enough to spend time figuring out where the codes for these cheat systems might even exist. There are a few built-in codes which are poorly described, and sometimes when loading a game it will let you know that X-Terminator codes are found. Assuming you do not want to activate Hyper Mode and use these codes, be sure to hit the Y button to skip this message and just play the game as normal. So that's about it when it comes to the Super UFO Pro 8. It's a flawed yet capable device that has fallen victim to a great deal of misinformation, much of which could have been avoided with better documentation and a little more thoughtful software design. It certainly wouldn't seem like a significant feat to make a more impressive successor, and if the EverDrive or SD2 SNES could just add the lock-on cartridge and ROM and save dumping features, the UFO would no longer have any advantage other than cost. And of course, if you want to get really into ROM dumping for the sake of long-term game preservation and helping ROM dumps get properly verified, there are of course much more serious tools out there for that purpose, and a special understanding of the hardware is needed to dump more complex cartridges. But for now, for the price, I'm happy enough having chosen the UFO as my own hobbyist ROM dumper and ROM hack playing flashcard for the SNES.